A Musical Life with film, TV, and video game composer Chad Seiter. Chad Seiter has composed and produced original music for several major Hollywood franchises such as Star Trek, Fringe, and Lost. He's also composer, music director, and associate executive producer for Pokémon, Symphonic Evolutions, and The Legend of Zelda, Symphony of the Goddesses touring concert series, performing symphonic arrangements of classic Nintendo scores with hundreds of the world's leading orchestras. Welcome to A Musical Life. I'm Hugh Sung. Chad Seiter is one of those composers lucky enough to create music that encompasses his passions for movies, TV, and video games. Chad started his career as an assistant to Academy Award-winning composer Michael Giacchino and has produced music for some top video game titles such as the 2013 Star Trek Videogame, based on J.J. Abrams' reboot film, and 2016's ReCore from Microsoft Studios. A die-hard retro gamer himself, Chad's symphonic arrangements of themes from classic Nintendo games have been a huge success and a great way to attract new audiences who have never been to a live symphony concert before. Let's start off by listening to the overture from his symphonic arrangement, Pokémon Symphonic Evolutions. Chad, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show.
Thank you, Hugh.
So, Chad, first off, one of the things that really impressed me when I visited your website was that I noticed that your Favicon, I don't know if this is a little bit of geekdom here, the Favicon are these tiny icons that appear on the top header of the web page. Okay, and so for Facebook, you'll see a blue F, a blue square with a white F inside of it. And for Gmail, you'll see the red M for Gmail. And for you, I see a Star Trek communicator insignia or Starfleet symbol. Something tells me you are a big Star Trek fan.
Yeah, guilty. And everyone has said, "Oh, you should update that to whatever the current project is." And I thought, I really I really like the Star Trek insignia. It was an honor to score a Star Trek game back in 20. Well, I guess it was 2013 now. So I think it can stay there for a while longer.
For my sake, please keep it there because I'm a big Star Trek fan too. So, okay, so which is your favorite series? I mean, from the original to the Next Generation to the reboot series. I mean, just personally, I know you've done work on the
I love Next Generation.
Yay!
Yeah, probably my favorite.
Yes.
But I really like DS9, Deep Space Nine, and I really like Voyager. And I really like the original series, and I really like Enterprise.
Oh, so you kind of like everything. All right, forget it.
I like something in all of them.
Yeah, and I have to confess, I really love the reboots. I know there are some Trekkie friends of mine that were really disappointed because it's too action oriented, but I don't know. I loved it. I thought it was great.
Hey man, I'm just happy for more Star Trek.
That's right. I agree with you. And I'm just putting myself in your shoes because I remember as a kid, going to the movies. I may be a few years older than you, but I remember as a young kid going to the very original Star Wars movies and just being so enthralled that I would sit behind it as I was listening to the credits. I would try to memorize the theme and go home and play the theme because the music was so powerful. Yeah. And I thought for years, boy, what a dream it would be to be John Williams, to be able to write music for all the coolest movies like that, and to be in your shoes, to be a Star Trek fan, and to get the call to write the music for the Star Trek video game. Wow, what a thrill that must have been.
And working on the movies, I worked for Michael Giacchino for a really long time, who's written the music to all the reboots, and he's a Star Trek fan as well. And I remember that when he called me to tell me that he was doing them, he was so excited. Just because I am one of the biggest Star Trek nerds anyone will ever meet.
Well, kindred spirits. This is so cool. And Michael Giacchino himself has also been really well known for his Call of Duty scores too, right?
He scored the first one and first two, yeah. Well, not Call of Duty 2. They made like a 1.5 in there. So he did those first ones. In fact, my first day living in Los Angeles, the first day I moved to LA was the very first Call of Duty session, and I got to go to it. And I was just a 20-year-old kid moving out to Los Angeles and sitting in on that with a giant orchestra at Sony on the Sony scoring stage was pretty incredible. It was like, yeah, this is what I want to do with the rest of my life.
All right, let's backtrack a little bit. So tell us where you moved from. Where is your hometown? Where are your roots? Where are your roots?
Well, I'm originally from Okemos, Michigan, and I went to school at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids, Michigan. I was actually originally studying computer science, and music was music. I knew I wanted to do music, but I thought, I need to get a degree in computer science. That'll be my backup job in case I fail. But then as I just fell in love working on music more and more, the backup job seemed irrelevant, really. And I thought, well, if I spend all this time focusing on a backup job, then the main job is never going to get highlighted. So I just kind of dropped it and just moved out to Los Angeles and got started.
Now, what were your early music education experiences? Were you studying an instrument? Did you study composition?
I started in elementary school with violin and moved on to cello. And I played that for a few years, and I found a real love for choir, actually. So I really spent a lot of time doing a lot of voice work, and I eventually started becoming interested in writing, and this is where the technology part kind of plays in, because my education is mostly on my own. I learn best on my own, and I got this program called Cakewalk Cakewalk Pro Audio. It might not even have been Pro Audio at the time, but it was version 3. It was on Windows 3.1. And you know what you were saying about uh, you said you'd listen to the Star Wars theme and try to figure it out and everything. I would do the same thing, and I remember uh, one of the Next Generation movies came out, the Star Trek Next Generation movies. I think it was First Contact,
Oh, that
and
was a good one. That was a really good
that's a
one.
beautiful theme. So when I first started experimenting was I found a MIDI file of it on the internet back when MIDI files were cool. Most people probably don't really know what they are anymore.
Yeah.
Um, and I opened it up, and there's all the instruments all spelled out and all the parts and everything, and I would just start analyzing the orchestration, and just listening to it, and then I would say, well, what if instead of the French horn playing the theme, what if a flute played it? And I would change the instrument to a flute, and then I'd listen to it and I'd say, this is way too low to be flute. I wouldn't even understand what I was doing was rudimentary transposition at the time. I'd just
Mm.
move it to a range where it sounded more flute-like and things like that. So I just kept exploring from there, really, and my interests just blossomed. It was a fun way to do it. I really appreciate all those days that my parents allowed me to just lock myself in my room tinkering.
Now, it's really fascinating because you're taking a programmer's approach to deconstructing music, very similar to the way a programmer might take a program, an open source piece of code, deconstruct it, play around with some of the elements to see if they could make it do what they wanted to do. Did you realize you were doing that at the time?
I didn't, and it's not even until the past few years that I actually came to that conclusion that that's how I do it. Most people run a program and a software program, and all they know is that it runs.
That's
But
right.
what they don't know is the chaos that goes on underneath the hood that makes it run, where people have had to figure out rules and loops for all kinds of things, and how it even gets done. I was never particularly good at computer science, but I always had a passion for it. I loved the technical aspects of it, and so and in some ways I've always taken that approach to music, studying it, learning how it works under the hood sonically, and I think it's why I've also taken to one of my favorite elements is orchestration. I spend a lot of time thinking about my orchestrations in my music, because I can look technically at all the instruments and figure out, well, what can I do with this guy on this score and things like that.
Now, this is really fascinating because obviously there's a close connection between your interests in computers and then today we see you doing incredible work writing so effectively for video games like the Star Trek game that came out in 2013 and more recently ReCore, I believe, which has been released by Microsoft Studios. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Because I would imagine that writing for a video game, even though there is a story per se, it's not a linear thing like a movie. And you have written for TV series like Fringe, and you've done work on other movies, but video game is much more fractured because you can't predict what the player is going to do. So I imagine that your computer science, understanding how programs work, would be a huge advantage in structuring your musical scores for the game.
I think we've moved. I think we've mostly moved beyond people saying that video games are not art. I think most people embrace them as such, but until you work on games or at least see a game getting made, I think there's no way you can deny that it's art, because you've got these brilliant minds just contributing code and textures and sound mapping, and I mean, you have to create a world from scratch. In a film, you find a place to film, you pick out your lenses and everything, but you have to make the world. You have to make the dent in the dirt that your character's foot puts in it, and you have to make that foot, and you have to put a sound effect with it, and you have to like just something so simple is m- days and weeks of work that a whole team put into just that one element. I think it's amazing that games even get made.
Mm.
It seems like an impossible task to me, and so writing the music, it's you have to kind of keep the same things in mind, that this project is growing into a final product that none of us are really going to know what it's going to be once it gets there, in many ways.
So I'd like to talk about the time from being a student in computer science to being a 20-year-old sitting in with Michael Giacchino and this incredible experience of watching a big score being recorded by an orchestra at Sony Studios. So how did this happen? I mean, typically I would think that a computer science graduate would be able to find work much more readily than a composer. How were you able to make the transition from school to breaking into the scene, for lack of a better term?
Well, I worked with Michael for a long time, like 10 years actually,
How
and
how did you make that connection?
I was friends with his current assistant at the time, and just joined in at a lot of events and everything, and got to know him. And when Lost came along, he thought that would be a good project for me to work on. Before that, I was doing studio work, maintaining computers, running errands, and stuff like that. And so it was cool to like work hard and grow into a musical job, and it only grew from there. So uh, I'm really appreciative of my time and knowledge I learned from him. He's an incredibly knowledgeable man.
Amazing. And did you? So I've heard this story from other composers as well who have worked as assistants and primarily maintaining the computers for more established composers. Were you given opportunities to share your own musical compositions with Michael? Did he ask for that or did you initiate it? How did you initiate that first musical introduction to help him be aware of what you were capable of musically, not just in terms of maintaining his
Yeah,
computers?
the fact of the matter is that you kind of, it's not necessarily the music, I think, that gets you in the door. I think it's your demeanor and your dedication, your focus. Just, are you willing to help? Because in many ways, when you hire people, you have to train them for their jobs, just like any job. So you have to, I would say, I even do this when I'm hiring people. I look to make sure that they can fit the mold of what I need in an employee more than their talent itself, which can, if I see potential in it growing, then that's fine. But at the end of the day, I still need someone to do, these procedural tasks.
Mm.
And it's almost like a like a boot camp. I used when I was working as an assistant, my wife and I would be watching Grey's Anatomy or something, and they'd be so mean to the interns. And I always thought, when I have interns, I'm never going to be mean like that to them. I'll never do that. But now that I got older, I realize why why they get hazed, because there's just so much to learn that's not just the craft itself.
Fascinating. Well, let's also talk a little bit. I understand you are a hardcore gamer, and I read someplace that you're passionate about Mega Man, which is a very popular game that's actually quite old, and you're such an expert at it. You're able to go through it at the top difficulty level super fast. Tell us about your passion for games, because it obviously leads very nicely into you creating music for some of these top triple A list games that are out there now.
Yeah, that's funny. I'm a huge Mega Man fan. I'm a big retro gamer. I have a massive retro games collection.
So let's explain it
Nintendo.
for folks who don't understand. This is
Yeah.
almost a whole new world. What are retro games?
Well, retro games are what we call old games, essentially. The Nintendo, the Super Nintendo, the Sega Genesis, the Game Boy. Um, I have all my original systems from when I was a kid, and I've had them modified actually for superior video output, and in many cases HDMI and perfect integer scaling to 1080p and everything. So they look as though they were invented today.
Wow.
And so I really like these old games. They're really a test of skill and memory and reflex. And I have a lot of fun playing them. Mega Man is by far my favorite, both with the mechanics, but I like the world that they created, and it left a lot to the imagination too,
Mm.
which was very inspiring to me.
So, how do you find time to play games when you're busy composing all this music?
Well, it's actually one of the skills Michael taught me was time management. He's very good with time management, and I know he's done interviews about his time management. You can read about it, but I try. Of course, when you're super busy, there's nothing that can be done. But I try not to work in the evenings
Oh, interesting.
because I try not to do any work slash music related stuff oftentimes in the evenings. Because I find that what will take me hours to do at night will take me 20 minutes in the morning.
Interesting.
So and I can go do other things, and all of these other things fuel my passion for music. So then when I come into the office, I might have watched a movie or played a game or gone out with my wife, and then when I come in the next day, I will have subconsciously thought about this and 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 just adapted it to my own workflow rather than slaving over music all night and nothing really got done, and then I come in and I'm already burned out.
That's a fascinating approach. I think this is the first time I've heard of that purposeful recreation used as creative fuel, as it were, so that you purposely play hard so that you can work hard. Would that be an accurate description?
Yeah, and it doesn't always work out. When you're busy, you're busy, but I always try to just make sure that I'm already sometimes an anxious guy, so anything I can do to reduce the anxiety is very nice. It's nice to just feel like I did a good day's work and
Mhm.
now I don't have to work. And so I feel like I work hard all day so I can earn that feeling.
So let's talk a little bit. I want to talk about the Star Trek score because you were gracious enough to share some of the tracks with me, as well as the more recent ReCore, which I believe came out in September of this year. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's talk about Star Trek. What was remarkable is that at the time, this you actually recorded this with a live orchestra, 123-piece orchestra, which at the time was the largest symphonic recording for a video game. How thrilling is that? And you also had a choir. You had mentioned your love of choral music. You had a choir with that as well. Is that correct?
Well, we had a choir for ReCore,
Oh, I'm
which
sorry. I'm
was
sorry. Okay,
which was
I'm getting
fun.
mixed up. Okay, I'm
But
getting
it's
mixed up.
funny you mentioned that because there was a lot of back and forth if I wanted to add choir to Star Trek.
Ah,
But I
interesting.
decided not to because none of the Star Trek there's never been a lot of choir in Star Trek, actually. There
Mm.
has been some, but never really much. So I thought, I don't know if I want to I don't know if I want to do that. I'll keep it like a legitimate orchestra score.
Were you given carte blanche to score it any way you wanted? I mean, or was there a strict budgetary thing that you had to adhere to?
Um, everything has a budget, and one of my, I've said this in an interview, and people are always interested in this too. One of my favorite aspects of a production is doing the budget. It's like it's building the sandbox that you're going to be playing in. So I like to really spend a lot of time up front getting my budget all worked out. And so it's like, could we have done choir? Yes, but does it really need it at that point and things like that? You just kind of you have to always take that stuff into consideration.
One of the things I find really interesting about the Star Trek video game music is that you actually take elements of Michael Giacchino's score. Now, he was the one who actually composed the themes and the music for the Star Trek reboot movies. And what I found really interesting is that you take his elements, his theme, and change them in your own ways. I'm wondering if you could share some examples of some of the ways that you took Michael's music and perhaps change them in really interesting, maybe creative ways that might have been unexpected.
Yeah, this was one of my favorite parts of the score. I loved. using Michael's themes. When he told me he was going to be doing the new Star Trek movies, I mean, I was thrilled because I love his sense of melody. So, and I was already a fan of all the current themes, so I knew this was going to be a rock solid addition. And when I first heard the theme, I was like, "Oh, this is so cool!" So, when he asked me if I wanted to score the game, and that was right. He was just getting started on Into Darkness, I believe. So we were going to be kind of working on that in parallel, on the Star Trek game. And originally, I thought it was going to be like adapting music from the other movies, and then they said, "Oh no, we need 120 minutes of new score." And I was like, "Oh crap!" And I called Michael and told him, and he's like, "Well, have fun." So I was like, "Cool, all right, I will. Thank you." So because it was being made by Paramount, it was all in the same creative IP pool, and we could use the Star Trek themes.
How cool!
So, which is fun because that's not always possible. And I've scored games for Michael where we couldn't license his themes, so we had to do knockoff versions of his own themes, which was always hilarious. We had so much fun doing it, but this was cool. So I really wanted it to just feel like Michael's scores. But of course that's impossible. So to strictly do that. So I just made sure to keep a creative fusion between like my voice and Michael's voice and themes and everything. And I think it turned out really, really great. I get a lot of compliments, and I'm quite proud of the work. But some of my favorite cues doing that are like, I wrote a main theme for the game called Brains and Brawn. The cool thing about Brains and Brawn is it's sort of a long form version of his Star Trek theme that's been kind of adapted and reworked to sit in this game's world. I find games work better with a little more long form, so loops don't become repetitive and everything. So I always try to take a small idea and stretch it out. But another cool cue is the Mothership, where I do a great quote of Michael's theme. I would try to, in every cue, slip in creative ways of putting his theme in there and using his motifs appropriately throughout.
Wow, thank you so much. That's so interesting just to hear how a composer can take another composer's idea and yet put their own voices into that. Now, with ReCore, of course, this new game that's being produced from Microsoft Studios. This was just released in September of 2016, and this is an opportunity for you to create a whole new IP sound and identity for yourself. This is all your own music, right? You didn't have to borrow anybody else's to come up with this, right?
Correct. This is 100% original.
So let's take a listen to a little bit of the main theme. I read someplace that when you were being approached, that you just basically saw a single picture, a single image, I guess a promotional image of the game, and you just wrote music based on what you felt from that one picture, and that became the main theme. And it's interesting, that main theme, again, I haven't played the game. I don't know anything about it, but there's a lone female voice that seems to indicate that the protagonist is a female, and there's elements I hear of, it seems more desolate. It seems almost Western-like. I hear this electric guitar at times in some of the other tracks where it almost reminds me of a sci-fi Western, if that makes any sense.
You are using literally every single buzzword that I described the score with. So really well done. You picked up on 100% of that.
No, I think it's a credit to you because you made that so clear with your writing.
Well, it does take place on a desert wasteland planet, and Jewel, the female protagonist, wakes up on this planet that was supposed to be terraformed, but something went wrong with the artificial intelligence on the planet itself. So she has to figure out what went wrong, all the while being attacked by this artificial intelligence named Victor. And she's got robot companions, but she's the only human. Well, or is she? But yeah, the main theme is a really great example of the ReCore sound. I didn't really pick a soprano soloist to represent Jewel being female, but instead I kind of wanted to give kind of a sensitive voice to her, because the cool thing about Jewel is she's really tough. She's really, really tough, and I think the rest of the score really embodies that. But she's got this vulnerable side to her that she occasionally lets show. And there's some really touching tracks like Dust Devil, where you hear her theme kind of wrapped within the main theme, and it's one of the few times she really gets to show her vulnerability. another track, the finale, is You've Never Been Alone. This is when she's reunited with her father, who is more or less part of the intelligence now. I guess I sort of...
Oh no!
It's been out for a while.
Spoiler alert!
And she's reunited, and there's just this really touching moment, and I wanted to really capture it. But what's cool about the ReCore score is I did want it to feel like a Western, and some tracks are way more Western-y than others, like The Cradle. The Cradle is actually Kai's theme, one of the other survivors. As far as we know, there's only seems to be two. But Kai, I just went full-on sci-fi Western for him. I just wanted it to feel really sensational and dramatic, and add some energy into what can otherwise feel like a really desolate, lethargic score.
I think the magic of listening to composers as they paint these sound landscapes, and part of the fun, of course, is listening to music without the visuals, is to try to figure out how in the world do they come up with these soundscapes. It's interesting that your choices of instruments and choices of timing and pacing tell the story almost in and of itself. Would you mind just kind of describing what creative tools you reached into to create these musical narratives?
Well, you might be opening a can of worms here. I could go on at length about this, but my main secret weapon is leitmotif. I'm a big fan of small motifs, and I like just, again, this might be my technical brain working. I like to assign motifs to practically everything within a world.
So let's try to, for those folks who are not musically inclined, leitmotif was, of course, something that John Williams uses very heavily in all of his scores. And I'm thinking of Star Wars, of course. Each character has a theme. Even the Force has its own theme. And when you hear that, you associate that with that character. Can you, maybe I already gave it away, but can you help us understand what exactly is the leitmotif technique?
Yeah, I think in this score there's something like 60 leitmotifs. A leitmotif is just I almost kind of think of them as little mini fanfares or little chimes, almost just little musical namesakes to a situation or a character or an environment, or just something that says... I kind of equate it to if you've ever been to Japan and you stand on the tracks. Well, don't stand on the tracks, just stand by the tracks, and all the trains have like a little musical anthem that plays for that line, and you can identify what train you're supposed to be on based on this little melody, this cute little melody that plays.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And they're all distinct and different. And so I think of leitmotif in the exact same way, where I'm just assigning little themes and ideas to everything. It just makes a really interesting piece of music and an interesting challenge to assemble it all together. So when I write a piece, I don't necessarily write a long form piece, but I think that the piece itself is a conglomeration of all the motifs that have been built throughout that scene in the game or in the film. And the piece itself is really just this hybrid of dozens of motifs all coming together in different ways, highlighting what's happening on screen.
That is so cool. What a great way to think about musical narratives. And it just, as opposed to the classical form, which depends on long developments, and
Yes.
long expositions. You are actually coming up with shorter fragments, as it were, and then creating different variations, different spin-offs, different ways of expositing those little tiny motifs. Yes?
Yes, and I think it makes the art form more interesting, at least to write the music. From I can't speak for the listener, but from my perspective, I sure have a lot of fun with it, and I don't ever feel like sometimes when I don't appropriately assign themes or motifs to things, I sometimes feel like I paint myself into a corner where I have
Mm,
nothing to say.
mm.
But as long as I have all these motifs, what I can do with them is essentially infinite. So I can as long as I think that they're cool little hooks, then I can come up with a billion different orchestration ideas for them and constantly be moving them around like a Jenga set, and just constructing these pieces fully out of little motifs, which is a lot of fun to me.
So I want to also ask you in terms of the instrumentation, it's interesting. We're going to hear some examples of early video game music because you've done something quite remarkable, transforming that into some of your symphonic orchestrations that are now on tour. But what I'm finding really interesting is the evolution of video game music from these primitive metallic sounding pips and squeaks to studios investing, for example, with the Star Trek video game, investing in a full orchestra. In fact, larger, orchestras are typically 100 players, and 123 players. That's a big, big orchestra. It's like a Mahler-sized orchestra. I'm finding it
Yeah.
really interesting that the studios, as they're getting more technologically advanced, they're turning more and more towards traditional musicians, traditional recording. Are you using live musicians as much as possible, or is it a mix between live musicians and um, and computer generated sounds?
Well, I would say it depends on what the score calls for. I typically tend to gravitate towards the orchestra. I love the art. I love collaborating. I love the feeling that the rush you get. My I always tell people that my favorite part of the recording session is the first 30 seconds,
Mm.
where you've been living with this, like in the case of ReCore, for a year and a half, I'd been living with this synth score and that had no heart and no soul. And then suddenly, and we work our butts off, my whole team, to get it to the stage. In this case, we recorded it in London with the Philharmonia Orchestra. Absolutely incredible. And we worked so hard to get it there, between the orchestration and the music preparation and music integration into the game and everything. And so my favorite part is that first 30 seconds where all that doesn't matter because here we are and it has just evolved and it's just blossomed and come to life. um, it's always an incredible feeling, so I try to get that rush as much as I can, and I really enjoy working with live players and hearing what they bring to it because I don't find it as fun doing it all by myself.
Isn't it interesting how, as advanced as our technologies are, there's still something indescribably thrilling when a live musician plays your music and recreates it in their own way, in ways that you might not have expected. Wouldn't you say?
Yeah, and and in fact with my traveling concert series, I would say the biggest orchestration lesson I've ever learned in my life is hearing the exact same music played by countless orchestras at this point. I wouldn't even know how to begin calculating how many orchestras have played it. It's probably easier to tell you all the orchestras that haven't played it. Yeah, and so it's just cool to go and you'll be in some markets and you're like, okay, they got that. That worked great. And then other markets where it's like, oh, maybe I need to reevaluate how I'm writing for this instrument because this market could pull it off, but this one's having trouble and things like that. So I can always kind of keep I kind of keep a subconscious tally in my head of what I'm doing right and wrong.
So you're referring to this really fascinating phenomenon of symphony orchestras, classical orchestras that are playing live concerts of video game music that you have arranged. Specifically, I know currently the Pokémon Symphonic Evolutions is on tour. I saw billboards for the Philadelphia Orchestra, I think, getting ready to play that.
Yeah.
And the Legend of Zelda, that came a little bit earlier, right? The Legend of
That
Zelda
was much earlier.
The Legend of Zelda
Symphony
of Goddesses. So what I want to do, which I thought would be kind of fun, is to play, we're going to play one of your favorite themes, which is called the Ballad of the Windfish. And I want to play the original version that you would have heard on the game. When did that game come out? That's actually a little while ago, right?
Oh, that would have been early 90s, probably, whenever the Game Boy came out. It was one of the earlier titles.
So let's listen to the Game Boy, the actual music that you would have heard on this tiny handheld video game. Let's hear the theme. So now let's listen to your symphonic version of the same theme. Chad, it's absolutely remarkable. It's the same theme, and yet the emotions are amplified almost 1,000-fold. And I think you were referring to, and perhaps maybe I was making the inference, because I've talked to other programmers who have been very dedicated gamers. And the thing that struck me was the passion that they have for the music. Because unlike watching a movie, which could be anywhere from an hour and a half to 2 hours, when you play these games, you're playing for 10, 20, 30, maybe hundreds of hours, and you're listening to some of these themes over and over again. I can't imagine a more concentrated way to have music so embedded into somebody's psyche and to spend that much time, and not just passively listening, but as you're acting, the music reacts with you and amplifies your actions. I'm wondering if you could speak to that in terms of this unique relationship between gamer and music and then, of course, your reinterpretation or magnification of what the music did to you as a gamer?
Oh, it's kind of I mean, we grew up. One of the things I always think about is when I was playing the old 8-bit Nintendo games in my house, and my dad would get tired of hearing the same things on loop back in the day.
Yeah.
And and he'd just get so frustrated sometimes with me playing the same song for hours. If everyone played the original Legend of Zelda, you hear the same 30-second loop for dozens of hours. I don't know how we did it, but it's definitely ingrained in our head. So in modern times, it's about recreating what you can do in those 30 seconds and turning it into a more long form approach that isn't quite as overbearing and obnoxious. And we do that through and it's becoming increasingly popular. It's through an interactive music system where we will actually write music for things that the game engine can compensate for. Like if you're getting low on health, these are simple examples that we may or may not have done on ReCore. These are just game examples these days, but like when you get low on health, the music might amp up in intensity, or you might be playing a battle segment that has several stages of intensity, where you start out and you're just sniping some guys, but by the end it's like full world war. And so it might play a lesser loop in that first sniping part, like a nice quiet loop for, that's a 1-minute piece of music, but then you'll move on and then it'll transition to the next piece. So the game is essentially creating its own underscore. And the idea being you're never going to quite hear the same thing twice.
Interesting.
And we did a lot of that on ReCore, and really tried to experiment with that, because there were some hurdles, being the gigantic open wasteland, and we didn't want music playing all the time. So we had to come up with really creative ways to tell the story with music without it becoming overbearing. So I always just think about my dad and how I never want to annoy him again.
And yet, when you analyze some of these video game scores, they are surprisingly complex. When kids want to learn to play the Super Mario theme, there's some really complex Latin rhythms in there. It's not an easy
Yes.
thing. And yet, it's a great teaching tool for teachers that are open-minded enough, not just think of this as just kiddie music, but it's actually sophisticated writing.
And when people call it kiddie music, or think it's somehow underdeveloped, it's really too bad that they're kind of closing their minds to it, because not only were these little melodies incredibly effective, but they
Yes.
were brilliant technical achievements at a time when there was not a lot of flexibility, where these melodies were written under tight conditions where they could only do 3 voices at one time. 3 notes could only play simultaneously. So these programmers had an incredibly daunting task of building their sandbox. Much like I said, I like doing the budget because it builds your sandbox for you. These guys' sandboxes were tiny. They only had three sounds to work with, and they weren't even flexible. Like what you could do with them were flexible, but they were a sine wave, a triangle wave, and a saw wave
That's
on the
it.
Nintendo with what they called a noise channel. So you could make like rudimentary percussive sounds and things. And so I mean, it's too bad when people say that, because it's like, look at these great iconic themes that have permeated our society and exist to this day, and they did that with only 3 notes simultaneously at any given point. That to me is remarkable.
Thank you so much for pointing that out. I'd love to just get back to this incredible endeavor you have with getting your video game scores performed by symphony orchestras around the world. Was this your idea? Did you spearhead this project?
This was a combination of me and in concerts. I have a producing partner named Jaron Moore, and him and I, we met at a party back in about 2010 and found we had the exact same musical tastes, although totally different skill sets. And he was more from a producer background, and I was from a music background. So we thought, let's make a show. Why don't we just do this? So it took a lot to build it into a business, but it's really been quite rewarding. And I wouldn't say that my life would be the same if I hadn't done it. Hearing just so many orchestras. In fact, right after this interview, I'm leaving to get on a plane to London to conduct the Royal Philharmonic.
You get to conduct them?
Yes.
Wow, how
So
exciting.
yeah. And it's given me a lot of opportunities to do great things, and it's made me a much better composer. Seeing the world is one of the best things you can do to to learn about yourself as a musician.
Now, was it difficult at the beginning to get these orchestras to accept the idea? I know in the past, classical orchestras were very limiting in terms of the kind of repertoire they would take on. Was it difficult to, for lack of a better term, sell the idea to them?
I think times are changing a little bit, and yes, that was true. But when we came into the scene, I think they were already starting to realize that there might be some merit in this. So we were pretty lucky, and most people bought our show. Most orchestras bought our show, but I think it's even gotten more. I think video games are here to stay, and I think people are finally beginning to just accept that and see it as the credible art form that it is, and a great new way of telling stories in modern times. And so I don't get as much pushback, and I would say even that it's kind of an old, at this point, kind of an old trope. I'm glad to think we're moving beyond that at this point. And I just conducted a show in Miami 2 weeks ago, and the orchestra was so friendly, coming up and saying, "Oh, I remember this theme from when my kid would play it." And by the way, it's not just relegated to this orchestra, but a lot of them will say, "Oh, I remember playing this game.
There you go.
I remember this theme from when my kid played the game," or I never knew that this was video game music. And usually, we have had orchestras that have a bummer vibe, and it's been kind of a downer. They don't get into it as much as we had hoped they would, but that's really rare at this point. Most orchestras are really enthusiastic about this at this point, and it shows in their performances, I think.
Now, was it difficult to approach Nintendo, who owns I understand they own the trademark for Pokémon? What was it like interfacing with them? How did you connect with them to get permission to use these themes?
Well, these companies are massive, and they have licensing departments that handle putting their IP in all kinds of, I mean, you see Mario cereal boxes, so they are accessible to these things, and as long as you have a good idea that really speaks to them creatively, I we didn't really run into trouble because everyone just thought it was really cool, just as cool as we thought it was. So in that way, we kind of scooched right up the ranks in a nice, easy fashion, and quite quickly too, because everyone just saw a lot of merit in getting this going.
And one of the biggest advantages, I would say, would be it exposes new audiences to the world of the symphony orchestra. And audiences would
Yes.
never go to a classical music concert now get excited. And these are sold out shows that expose thousands and thousands of people to the possibilities of what an orchestra can really sound like and the experience of hearing that kind of a sound.
Absolutely. We always kind of ask the audience, like, who here has seen an orchestra show before? I mean, who hasn't seen an orchestra show before? And there's a startling number of people that cheer, which is unfortunate, but they love it. And I'm glad that we could provide them a medium to get them into the concert hall and hear live music. It's just so important, and especially with a symphony orchestra, which is timeless. I think, unlike many other musical forms that kind of date itself to your time period, which is great. Don't get me wrong, but orchestra is something that permeates all time periods, I think. And so being able to find a way to share this art form with a younger audience is really encouraging to me. I think it's important that they hear it.
And hopefully more and more orchestras will realize the benefit to using projects like yours to reach new audiences, new listeners. And I wanted to just end off by mentioning that I believe your wife is a conductor as well and a collaborator. Your wife, Susie Benchel-Seiter. Tell us a little
Yeah.
bit about this wonderful woman in your life who conducts your music and also assists you in your orchestrations.
Susie is awesome. She is currently it's funny. I'm conducting the Royal Philharmonic in London because she's currently in Sofia, Bulgaria, conducting Frozen Live right
Oh,
now.
wow.
So we're both going to be in Europe working on entirely separate projects. But Susie does all my orchestration, and we do all our own music prep in house between her and my assistant. We all work as a really tight team, and it works really nicely because we're just this one-stop shop for music production. And she can do absolutely anything. She conducts, she orchestrates. She's awesome.
What a terrific collaboration. What a thrill it must be to be with somebody that you can have such creative energy with. Well, I compliment both of you for being able to work together and just, that's what a thrill.
It wasn't always easy. It took some time, but once you build a level of trust, I just implicitly trust her
Mm.
and know that everything is going to be taken care of super meticulously and with tender loving care.
Mm.
I don't even ever worry.
So I'd like to close off with a final question. What are some new and exciting upcoming projects for you? I mean, I know you're getting ready to go on a flight to go conduct your music in London, but what's next?
Well, one thing coming up that I'm particularly excited about is I am scoring an independent game for my friend Zach Quarles, who works at Microsoft as one of the audio directors. He's making a game called Archangel, and I'm particularly excited about that. We're gonna be playing around with some interesting sounds and doing some new stuff with a much smaller orchestra than ReCore, which was I would say unlimited in scope and size. So this will be fun to tighten it up and play with smaller sounds, and I'm pretty excited about that.
Chad, thank you so much for being on the show. What fun to meet a fellow Trekkie, a fellow musician, and a gamer. It's just all these fun things, and just I can. It's just what a thrill it must be to be living all your passions simultaneously.
Well, thanks, Hugh. I really I feel very fortunate in my job, and always am excited about the next project and where it'll take me. It's fun to have kind of an eclectic base. I would never want to do any one thing almost. It's
Mm.
fun to experiment with so many options.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.
For links to Chad's website, visit the show notes at amusicallife.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter to get the latest updates on future episodes. You can also subscribe to A Musical Life through iTunes or with your favorite podcast playing app and get new episodes automatically downloaded onto your smartphone, tablet, or computer. If you enjoy these stories about making music and the things that move our souls, please tell a friend about this show and consider posting a short review on iTunes at amusicallife.com/review. Thank you for your support. Until next time, I'm Hugh Sung, and I wish you a musical life.